The late afternoon sun draped the quiet town of Rosebridge Hollow in soft amber light. Lawns were freshly cut, mailboxes stood perfectly aligned, and wind chimes offered their gentle tune in the breeze. It was the kind of place where everything seemed in its place, and everyone liked it that way. Down at the end of Sycamore Lane, a dusty red pickup truck came to a slow stop in front of a modest single-story house. The truck, older than most vehicles in the neighborhood, creaked slightly as the engine shut off. The door opened, and out stepped a man who didn't seem to belong, at least, not in the eyes of those already watching from behind curtain slits. He wore a flannel shirt, faded jeans, and a cap that had clearly seen years of use. His skin was deep brown, his beard silver and well-kept. There was nothing flashy about him, nothing that drew attention except perhaps the way he moved. Slow, deliberate, unbothered. His name was Walter Briggs, and he had just moved in. To the longtime residents of Rosebridge Hollow, new neighbors were rare, and ones like Walter even rarer. No formal welcome committee appeared, no handshakes, just glances, measured. Mistrustful. Walter didn't seem to mind. He quietly began unloading boxes from the truck bed, working at his own pace. A worn cooler, a toolbox, and an old armchair came first. He paused now and then to stretch, taking in the stillness of the neighborhood or maybe gauging the unease that now stirred behind each window. He wasn't in a hurry. He had seen too much of the world to be rattled by suspicious stares. For now, he was just a man unpacking a life and perhaps, unknowingly, preparing to challenge the very fabric of the town itself. From her porch swing, Sandra Whitmore sipped lukewarm tea and narrowed her eyes at the end of Sycamore Lane. The newcomer had been there less than a day, and already things felt off. She didn't like clutter, didn't like noise, and most of all, didn't like unpredictability. And something about that old truck and the man beside it whispered all three. Sandra wasn't just another neighbor. She was president of the Rosebridge Hollow Homeowners Association, a title she carried like a badge of honor. The kind of woman who color-coded bylaws and memorized yard measurement codes. Her hair was always pinned tight, her voice sharp as a bell, and her tolerance for anything out of place was virtually non-existent. And Walter Briggs was, in her mind, out of place. The lawn not edged, the garage partially open, a cooler? On the driveway? Sandra clicked her tongue, disgust bubbling beneath her otherwise calm exterior. She didn't need to know the man to know he didn't belong, not here, not in her carefully maintained kingdom. She reached for her phone but paused. No, first impressions were important, and she would be the one to set the tone, not with kindness, with authority. Inside the house she called out, "Carla, grab the clipboard, we've got a code violation." Her niece, barely 19, appeared in the doorway with a tablet in hand. She didn't ask questions, she knew the drill. Together, they marched toward the street like they'd done a dozen times before, policing porch lights and mailbox colors. But this time, Carla hesitated. "A cooler, Aunt Sandra? He just got here." Sandra's lips thinned. "Today it's a cooler. Tomorrow it's a broken gate and a dog off leash. It always starts small." And with that, she led the way, unaware she was walking straight into a lesson she'd never forget. Walter had just settled the last box on his porch when he noticed them coming. Two figures, one older and stiff with purpose, the other younger and clearly reluctant. They weren't waving, they weren't smiling, they walked like enforcers, not neighbors. Walter straightened up, wiped his hands on his jeans, and waited. Sandra Whitmore stopped at the edge of his driveway, arms crossed, chin slightly raised. Behind her, Carla fidgeted with a clipboard she clearly didn't want to be holding. "You must be the new resident," Sandra said, her tone already carrying the weight of judgment. Walter nodded slowly. "Afternoon. I'm Sandra Whitmore, president of the Rosebridge Hollow Homeowners Association," she declared, as if it were a position of legal power. "And this is my niece, Carla, HOA assistant." Walter gave a polite nod to the younger woman, who offered a small smile before quickly looking away. Sandra's eyes scanned his property like a customs officer. "You've got boxes sitting in the open, garage door halfway up, and a cooler? On the driveway?" Walter glanced over his shoulder at the items. "Still unpacking," he said, calm as ever. Sandra's mouth tightened. Unpacking is fine, but we have standards in this community. Appearances matter, first impressions matter, and right now, Mr. Briggs, Walter supplied. Yes, Mr. Briggs, right now, your property isn't exactly compliant. Walter took a step forward, not aggressive, just present. Compliant with what exactly? Sandra blinked, clearly not expecting to be questioned. The HOA guidelines, she snapped. Section 2.3, visible clutter. Section 3.1, open garage doors when not in use. I could go on. You memorized all that? Walter asked, half impressed. Of course I have, Sandra said, mistaking his tone for admiration. It's the only way to preserve the integrity of this neighborhood. Walter's eyes narrowed just slightly. You mean, the appearance of control? Carla's eyes flicked up at that. Sandra bristled. Excuse me? I've been here less than 24 hours, Walter said. And you're already at my driveway with a clipboard and a list of infractions. You didn't come to welcome me. You came to correct me. You think this is personal? Sandra scoffed. I treat everyone the same. Walter raised a brow. Do you? There was a pause. The breeze shifted, carrying the scent of cut grass and something sharper discomfort. Sandra pressed forward. Look, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. I'm within my rights to issue a formal complaint. If you don't bring this property up to standard by end of day tomorrow, we'll proceed accordingly. Walter studied her, not with fear, with something closer to pity. He wasn't surprised. He'd seen people like her before, people who clung to rules not to serve the community, but to control it. To protect their idea of what and who belonged. He took a step toward the porch, reached into a box, and pulled out a small leather wallet. Calmly, deliberately, he opened it and turned it toward Sandra. Inside, gleaming under the sunlight, was a gold star badge. Sheriff, Rosebridge County. Silence fell like a curtain. Sandra's mouth opened, but no words came. Carla's eyes widened as she leaned in to read the name engraved on the badge. Sheriff, Sandra finally managed, voice caught somewhere between disbelief and embarrassment. Walter nodded, closing the badge and sliding it back into his pocket. Sworn in last Friday. Official jurisdiction begins this week. Sandra stepped back, flustered. I didn't know. No one told us. You didn't ask. Carla lowered the clipboard, her shoulders slumping with quiet relief. Walter looked at Sandra again, softer this time. Look, I'm not here to disrupt anything, but I won't be policed on my front lawn by someone who thinks a cooler on a driveway is a crisis. Sandra stiffened. There are standards. And there's also grace, Walter interrupted gently. You may want to consider offering some, not just to me, to everyone. The breeze picked up again. Somewhere, a wind chime tinkled, light and harmless, in stark contrast to the tension hanging in the air. Sandra looked down, her voice smaller now. You should have said something sooner. I was planning to, Walter said. After the unpacking, over coffee maybe. Carla let out a small laugh, not mocking, just genuine, the kind that slips out when pressure breaks and something true gets in. Walter turned toward his porch. You two want some lemonade? I've got a cooler full of it. Carla looked at her aunt. Sandra hesitated, then shook her head. Another time. Walter nodded, unfazed. Suit yourself. As he returned to his work, Sandra remained still for a moment longer. Her face, once full of certainty, now showed something else: doubt, reflection. And maybe, just maybe, the beginning of humility. For a moment, the entire street seemed to hold its breath. Sandra Whitmore's lips parted, but no words came. Her clipboard, once clutched like a shield, hung uselessly at her side. The breeze caught the edges of the paper, flapping them like a flag in retreat. Carla stood a step behind, watching her aunt with wide eyes, the tension between pride and shame thick in the air. The badge, that gleaming symbol of authority, was gone now, tucked back into Walter Briggs's pocket, but its presence still lingered, echoing in every corner of the confrontation they had walked into so confidently. Sandra had come expecting submission. What she found was strength, quiet, deliberate, and unshakable. "You're the sheriff?" she asked again, as if saying it aloud would somehow make it less true. Walter didn't gloat, he didn't smirk. He simply gave a small nod, his face composed, his voice even. "Yes, ma'am. Sworn in just last week. Rosebridge Hollow is now under my jurisdiction." Carla swallowed hard, lowering the clipboard slowly. "We didn't know, no one told us." Walter turned his gaze toward her, softer than it had been. "You didn't ask." The words weren't cruel, they were just the truth, plain and piercing. Sandra blinked, her breath catching. She had always seen herself as a guardian of order, the protector of the neighborhood's character, but now she was realizing that character hadn't included everyone not equally. Her rules, her routines, the way she approached standards they hadn't protected, they had excluded. "I thought I was doing the right thing," she said, her voice unsteady. "I've always tried to keep this community safe, beautiful, respectable." Walter raised an eyebrow, folding his arms. "And who decides what's respectable?" The question landed harder than she expected. She glanced around the street, freshly painted fences, trimmed hedges, matching mailboxes, a curated life. But in that moment, all she saw were walls, walls that had been built not to welcome, but to contain. "I didn't mean any harm," she offered, the words thin and familiar. "It's just, this is how we've always done it." Walter took a step closer, not threatening but firm, present. "And maybe that's the problem." Sandra dropped her gaze. It was rare for her to be without words, but what could she say? That she hadn't seen him as more than a box on a porch, a problem to correct before it got out of hand. That she'd sized him up in a glance, assumed everything about him based on the make of his truck and the tone of his skin. Carla, quiet until now, stepped forward. "Sheriff Briggs, I'm sorry. I should have said something sooner. I knew this didn't feel right." Walter looked at her, nodded slowly. It takes more strength to speak up than to follow someone in silence. Carla's cheeks flushed, but there was gratitude in her eyes. Sandra tried again. "I didn't know who you were." "And yet you thought you had the right to tell me who I should be," Walter replied, calm but unrelenting. "You didn't come to introduce yourself. You came with a list." The clipboard, still in Carla's hands, suddenly seemed heavy, embarrassing. "I let the rules define the person," Sandra said, voice cracking, "and forgot that people are more than what's on paper." Walter's posture relaxed, just slightly. "That's all I wanted you to see." He wasn't angry. That, perhaps, was the most disarming part of all. He wasn't demanding an apology. He wasn't waving his authority like a weapon. He had revealed who he was, not to shame them but to teach them. To hold up a mirror. Sandra looked him in the eye, for the first time truly seeing him not as an infraction, not as an outsider, but as a man, a neighbor, a protector. "I was wrong," she said quietly. "About you. About this." Walter didn't smile, but there was warmth in his voice. "It's not about being wrong. It's about what you do next." Silence fell again, but this time, it wasn't cold, it was thoughtful. A couple of neighbors across the street had come out, pretending to check their mail, their eyes flicking toward the small gathering. They'd seen enough to know something had changed. Sandra turned to Carla, then back to Walter. "I'll bring this up with the HOA, how we welcome new residents, how we enforce rules, and how we see people." Walter gave a small nod. That would be a good place to start. Carla spoke up once more, this time with quiet conviction. "If we're building a community, it should start with respect, not suspicion." Walter looked at her, truly looked, and nodded. "You're learning fast." Sandra let out a slow breath. Her shoulders slumped, not from defeat, but from the release of years of rigid control. "Maybe it's time I did too." They turned to leave, not in shame, but in reflection. No more posturing, no more clipped tones or rules as weapons. Walter remained in his driveway, watching them disappear down the street. The neighborhood had not changed in appearance. The grass was still green, the houses still neat, but something beneath the surface had shifted. Perception. Pride. Possibility. He looked up at the sky, where the afternoon sun had dipped lower, casting a long, warm shadow across his porch. This wasn't about asserting authority. It was about offering perspective and letting people decide what they'd do with it. And in that silence, in that soft unraveling of assumptions, something new had quietly begun. The next morning, Rosebridge Hollow looked the same. Lawns were trimmed, flags fluttered quietly on front porches, the neighborhood still shimmered with its carefully maintained charm. But behind the hedges and flower beds, something unspoken had shifted, not in the landscape, but in the people. Sandra Whitmore didn't speak of the incident directly. She returned to her porch, same chair, same cup of tea, but her clipboard stayed tucked inside a drawer. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to sit still, not as an overseer, but as a neighbor. She watched the children bike past Walter Briggs' driveway without scolding them about helmets. She nodded at passing joggers without asking which house they belonged to. And she avoided the end of Sycamore Lane for 3 days. When she finally walked by, she didn't have a list or an agenda. She had a Tupperware of banana bread and a note card folded neatly in half. Walter wasn't home, so she left them on his porch. The card said only 3 words: "You were right." Carla, for her part, began speaking more at HOA meetings gently, but firmly. She raised questions about enforcement tone, about fairness, about whether standards were being used as fences or bridges. Some rolled their eyes, but a few nodded. Walter said nothing about it. He watered his plants, painted his mailbox, talked with the mailman. Life returned to a steady rhythm. He didn't patrol with his badge. He didn't give speeches. But when a young couple moved in across the street, Latinx, quiet, hesitant, and parked their beat-up minivan by the curb, no one said a word. No notes were left on their windshield. No clipboard appeared at their door. Instead, Sandra brought over lemonade. Walter watched from his porch, sipping coffee, the sunlight warm on his shoulders. Change doesn't always come loud. Sometimes it begins in silence, and grows each time someone chooses kindness over control. Walter Briggs stood at the edge of his front lawn, the morning sun casting long, golden lines across the street. A light breeze stirred the branches overhead, and the scent of jasmine drifted on the air. Around him, Rosebridge Hollow went about its routine: dogs being walked, sprinklers ticking rhythmically, quiet voices murmuring over coffee on porches. It was the same neighborhood. But it wasn't the same town. There were no headlines, no town hall proclamations, yet in the days since that quiet confrontation, something in the rhythm of Rosebridge had shifted. It was in the way people paused a beat longer before judging. The way Sandra Whitmore had started smiling at the very neighbors she used to correct. The way Carla had found her voice in meetings that once echoed with only one tone. And Walter? He had made no public address, no grand gestures. He never even mentioned what had happened that afternoon. He didn't need to. That was never the point. He planted herbs by the front steps, repaired the loose gutter with care, and waved to passers-by with the same steady calm he'd brought to his first day. Some waved back, some lingered a little longer to talk. Others still watched from a distance, unsure, but thinking. It was enough. One afternoon, as he raked leaves along the curb, a teenager from 3 doors down stopped mid-skateboard and mumbled, "Hey, Sheriff." Walter looked up, smiled, and replied simply, "Call me Walter." The boy grinned, nodded, and rolled off. No lecture, no warning. Just a moment of ease between generations, held together by mutual respect. That was what Walter brought, not the loud authority of sirens and orders, but the kind of leadership that lives in gestures, how a man listens before he speaks, how he holds his ground without raising his voice, how he leaves room for people to become better without shaming them into it. His strength wasn't in the badge, though the badge carried weight. It was in the silence he held when Sandra's words faltered. In the patience he offered instead of punishment. In the way he reminded a town of its better self, not by force, but by example. Months passed. The cooler that once caused controversy now sat at the side of Walter's porch, filled with lemonade on hot days. Neighbors stopped by from time to time, some for a glass, some for advice, and others just to sit. No one mentioned the rules anymore. But they remembered the moment the rules had changed. Because of him. And not because he demanded it. but because he made it impossible not to look inward. Walter didn't come to Rosebridge Hollow to shake things up, he came for quiet, for rest, for a home. But in giving the town his stillness, his steadiness, and his unshakable dignity, he gave them something more valuable than order. He gave them a better way to live with each other. And that was his quiet strength.